Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Hello, everyone. I am Richard Christel. I am the Program Officer here at the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at the Center for International Private Enterprise. I'd like to thank you all for listening to the podcast today. Today, we have Thom Townsend of Open Ownership, and he'll be giving us an overview of beneficial ownership transparency, the movement thus far, where we're going with it. And with that, I'll hand it over to Thom. So could you introduce yourself, Thom, say a little bit about yourself and Open Ownership?
Hi, Richard. It's great to be here, and thank you for having me. My name's Thom Townsend. I'm the Executive Director of Open Ownership. We're a small organisation spread out all over the world that works with about 30 countries to practically implement reforms on beneficial ownership. So how do we get governments from a place where most of them are now, which is that they're not collecting this information, they have little awareness of company ownership in their jurisdiction, to putting into place the legislation, the systems to collect that data and process it, and then where countries are choosing to publish it openly, make sure that data comes out in a really effective and useful way. So our organization works on that direct assistance to countries to make that happen. We also do a huge amount of research work because this is a really new space, relatively speaking. So figuring out what works and then telling the world about it. So hopefully countries that come along and do this reform later don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And then finally, we build technology to support that. So we have a data standard, a way of structuring this information to make it as useful as possible. We also collect and then share and make searchable all information about beneficial ownership that's publicly available. So that's us. We've been around since about 2017. So we're a relatively young organization, but yeah, we're busy.
It's good to hear. Well, could you give the audience a quick overview of what is beneficial ownership transparency?
So a beneficial owner is a kind of counterintuitive thing in a way. It sounds positive. It's beneficial, right? What we really mean about it is the real people that either own or control a company. And people might just be thinking, well, we kind of already know that, right? You have to register a company and you have to put some names down. But actually, when you're doing that, you're just talking about legal ownership, people who are directors or company secretaries, depending on what that's called in a different jurisdiction. What we're really interested in, though, is the people behind all of that, the people that really own and control something. And it's that information which over the last couple of 100 years has in most jurisdictions become ever more harder to find out by governments themselves and also other people within the marketplace. So the transparency bit of this is about saying actually the real owners and controllers of companies should be publicly available. That information should be easy to access. You should be able to find it in a fast way, in a machine readable way, and be able to use it for whatever reason you want. So the kind of two important concepts underlying this issue really is a beneficial owner is a natural person, and a beneficial owner should always be a human being who is alive. A legal person is a company. It's not a real person. It's called a legal person because it can do the things a person can. A legal person, a company, can take out a contract. It can have debt against it. It can behave, at least in the sort of world of commerce, exactly as a person does. But it isn't a person. It's a legal person. So these are the two important concepts. Legal person, company, natural person, real breathing human being that's behind a company and owns and controls it.
So you spoke a bit about a couple 100 years of evolution. So can you take us back to the beginning? How did we get from basic companies to where we are today?
It's a good question, and it's not a particularly well-known story. I live in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and the story really starts here. So if you wind the clock back to 17th century Amsterdam and the kind of beginning of sort of international trade in lots of ways, or sort of large-scale commercial international trade, you had very rich merchants living in the beautiful townhouses that everyone has either seen or seen a picture of here in Amsterdam. And they wanted to put some of their wealth into some expeditionary mission to a different part of the world to go and often pillage the riches of far and distant lands. They wanted to do that, but they also wanted to protect their house and their wealth. The way that they did that was to create the idea of limited liability. So create this thing called a company, a limited liability company, which they could put their wealth into. And when inevitably one of those ships sank or was otherwise destroyed and the money was never returned to them, they wouldn't be personally liable for that. The debt would be housed inside of that limited liability vehicle. So it allowed for greater speculation, and it allowed for the kind of golden era of Amsterdam to flourish. And it became and really kind of remains a very rich city as a result of all of that. But that's where it comes from. People wanting to speculate and wanting to speculate in what was at the time an extremely risky endeavor. Can't quite remember the percentage, but probably more than half of those ships, those investments, never returned to the Netherlands or found their way anywhere else. So that's kind of where the root of this comes from. And then you fast forward a few hundred years and you think about the 19th century, in Europe at least. It wasn't actually that common to have corporations or incorporated companies. They were quite few and far between, and they often required, in the UK at least, a royal charter, or in the US, an act of Congress or an act of Parliament in the UK. So corporation or corporation law evolved pretty slowly and hesitantly throughout the 19th century, but the US really took a lead, as you'd expect. So it wasn't really until the 20th century that you see this huge explosion of people coming into the kind of formal economy and wanting to create businesses. But it should be said that kind of corporate registration made it easier to form a company, but really, and kind of counterintuitively from the way that we think about this now and the problem of anonymous companies, it was really an effort to kind of standardize and regulate corporate incorporation to curb speculative activity, just for government to get a handle on it. So it's not really until the middle of the 20th century that you see the manifestation of a particular problem that we care about in the anti-corruption world, of tax havens and places in which you could store wealth that perhaps you shouldn't have without the rest of the world knowing. So it's been pretty hesitant. But I think this issue around transparency is an interesting one, because if you wind the clock back to that origin story here in Amsterdam in the 17th century, there was never an intention that the real owner of a company, or the real owners behind a limited liability company, should be anonymous. There was no need for that. You lived in a big house. You wanted people to know you were speculating. That made you bigger and better in society. So it's really only been in the last sort of 100 years or so that we have sort of by default just sort of assumed that information should be private. So if you fast forward into, say, the 1970s, with the passage in the US of the Banking Secrecy Act in 1970, that was the first attempt to say the government should have any role or any knowledge of what was going on within the banking system. And you saw immense pushback against that, particularly, frankly, from organized criminals who wanted to be able to take large sacks of dollar bills or higher denomination bills and deposit them in a bank and have no questions asked. So I said this at the start, but we're dealing with a pretty new reform here. And in sort of policy reform terms, if we go back to 1969, we've got almost total banking secrecy, total anonymity, should you wish to have it, of a beneficial owner. So in a kind of 50-year period, we've gone from that to this becoming an issue that is seriously relevant today. And as we'll probably come on to talk about, it's gained ever greater prominence, and rightly so, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because we're now talking about oligarchs running around the world, stashing wealth in countries, and we want to know who they are. So it is still new. We're still figuring out how to do it, but we've kind of stumbled our way into corporate or beneficial ownership anonymity. There was never a real choice around that. So this is kind of what we're trying to unravel now. And there are issues around it. There is a legitimate claim that people should have privacy about their wealth and what they own. That's a sort of separate argument from being transparent about the companies you control. Because ultimately, if you have a legal person, a company that's out there making contracts, well, if I'm making a contract with a company, I kind of want to know the human beings behind it. So I think it's kind of counterintuitive that we've got to a place where it's assumed that there should be anonymity around beneficial ownership and wealth. And really the work that we do, and so many others in the space, fantastic work that others do in the space, is trying to unpick 200 years of sort of assumed anonymity and figure out where we go next in the 21st century.
The problem is anonymity in company ownership, right? Like you rightly pointed out, you have issues with oligarchs, you have issues with fraud and corruption. So were there specific events that propelled beneficial ownership to, I guess, like a higher standing and like, we need to solve this problem?
I think the September the 11th attacks on the US were a bit of a turning point, really. Very soon after that, the Financial Action Task Force, which is part of the OECD and sets international rules around how the financial system should be governed, decided that in response to the terror financing threat, we had to strengthen our rules against money laundering, against company anonymity, at least to governments, so governments knowing who owns businesses in their country, because there was an existential national security threat that the Western world and the world at large was facing. So I think October 2001 is a turning point when I think governments around the world sort of began to think, actually, we do now need to take a greater interest in what's going through our financial system. That's not to say the problem was solved. Clearly it hasn't been. But I think that's one of the big turning points. I think also in the 2010s as well, diplomatic efforts by the UK and other governments really to push this to the forefront, to say that, money laundering is a problem. Anonymous companies often housed in low tax jurisdictions are the getaway vehicle of choice, which is the favorite phrase, this getaway vehicle of choice for those doing wrong in the world, particularly those leaders or political leaders around the world that are stealing money from countries that can ill afford it, and they're stashing it for their own benefit offshore. So this, as an issue in the anti-corruption space, has become totemic, because fundamentally the argument is that we are not going to be able to address any of the challenges we face in the world in terms of how we improve services and public services around the world if we're not able to actually retain the money that the country is owed and tax the money that the country is owed, but also simply stop those people who are in positions of power from stealing it. And if you're able to find a safe haven somewhere to stash your cash anonymously, that route will always be open to you. So it's about closing that down. So the 2010s come around, and I think there's a recognition that from a sort of global development perspective, from a human development perspective, solving this problem kind of takes you all the way upstream to one of the root causes of why there is not enough money to do the things we know that need to be done. So 2016 rolls around, and a former UK Prime Minister, David Cameron, led a big summit in London, which really put the issue on the map in terms of something that the big economies should care about. So from sort of 2016 onwards to now, we see this massive uptick in countries pushing ahead with this reform. So if we look back to 2016, we had 4, 5, 6 or so countries making some effort towards meaningfully doing something about this and committing to public beneficial ownership information. Now that figure's more than 100. Be it the government has a clear idea who those people are, who those beneficial owners are, and companies have to disclose at least to government, or they're doing that and publishing the data openly. So it's a real sort of hockey stick, if you were imagining the graph, of kind of commitment to this issue. But the thing with this is that commitment, as with anything, is really only the start. What we have yet to see is at-scale delivery across a critical mass of jurisdictions around the world. So we have the commitment, we have a burgeoning range of knowledge from governments themselves, from the banking sector, from civil society about how to do this well. And that's where we see our role in all of this. How do we effectively do this reform so it achieves what we want to? So we're in a good place. I think sometimes the kind of community of civil society can be quite down on itself and feel that no progress is being made. Actually, if you were to compare the progress of this reform in terms of 4, 5, 6 countries 7 years ago to where we are today, it's lightning speed. So we're in a good place, but now the task is the long, hard grind of actually getting it done and getting it done well and delivering on the promise.
Well, so you touched on that now we've got all the commitments. Now we just need to implement it. So are there any, I guess, challenges to implementation? Are there any sort of external stakeholders who are like, I don't want that?
There's one or two, yeah. I think dealing with those two issues separately, on the first one, what are the kind of challenges? Well, there's always one of resourcing, particularly in governments that have smaller numbers of officials, are less, technically mature in terms of the technology they have access to or have installed. In those countries, you're seeing a real willingness to do the work, but there's a lot of kind of work that needs to be done to build the foundations for that. So getting the systems in place, communicating that the reform is happening effectively, getting different departments that need to be involved in this kind of process working together effectively. So there's all of those kind of practical challenges that exist when you're trying to do any sort of material reform to how, public policy works. On the other side of the equation, who are the people pushing back against this? Well, quite clearly, if you have benefited from anonymity of company ownership, you are the first in line to say that it's a terrible thing. We have seen a kind of, in general terms, there's a lot of sort of poorly directed hand-wringing from people that wish to maintain anonymity about how terrible this is for their privacy. And often you'll hear, well, culturally, of course, we really don't want to kind of tell the world about our wealth. And my response to that is always, well, what suit are you wearing? What dress are you wearing? What watch are you wearing? What car are you driving? Pretty much everything you do says something about your wealth, but fundamentally you would rather not have your beneficial ownership revealed. Like, that argument doesn't necessarily hold water. There are those in jurisdictions that say revealing this information about me causes me direct harm or can cause me direct harm. We often hear about a kind of kidnapping threat. If people know I'm wealthy, they'll come after my family. Well, again, in most communities, you already know who the wealthy people are to a greater or lesser degree. So without undermining their legitimate fears, I think part of that argument doesn't necessarily hold up. But in certain circumstances, I think particularly where there's a fragile peace process perhaps happening, where full transparency around wealth in a particular society can destabilize those sorts of political processes, I have a lot more sympathy for that. It's interesting if we think about what actual legal action has been brought against transparency of company ownership. And it's mostly happened in the European context because since 2018, there's been a part of the fifth anti-money laundering directive in the EU means that EU countries should be publishing this openly. I mean, most of them are not for a whole bunch of different reasons. That's a whole other kind of podcast. But where the legal action has been brought, you've seen pretty spurious allegations of harm. So one of the cases that comes to mind was here in the Netherlands, where a privacy group said that a family whose beneficial ownership had been revealed, one of their children was called a name in the schoolyard because they found out that their family was wealthy. I don't know how a kind of secondary school kid was necessarily accessing all that information to begin with, but that was the harm that was cited. There was another part of that case which said that the beneficial owner of a local football team became known to the fans, and a couple of them turned up at this person's house and knocked on the door and complained that this person was not investing enough in the local football team. So those were the two harms. So in 2016, we were kind of told about this kind of apocalyptic world in which kidnap became the norm because beneficial ownership information had been made public. And actually what that case said was, unfortunately, a kid got called a name in a schoolyard and someone had their front door knocked and a demand for greater investment in a local football team. So as it currently stands, the harms that were talked about for a very long time have yet to materialize. That is not to say that they can't. Of course, any information and data that is put out there can be used and weaponized in lots of interesting ways that original policymakers haven't thought about. But to date, we haven't seen it.
So it sounds like there's unintended consequences of transparency, potential unintended consequences of beneficial transparency. And I'm sure we could have an entire podcast on just those potential unintended consequences. But if you're an average small business owner, is there anything you should be worried about, like with beneficial ownership transparency, or is that not big of an issue?
I don't think so. I mean, if you look at the figures from the UK, the average number of beneficial owners for the majority of companies in the UK is 2.4 or something like that. So most companies have extremely straightforward company structures. I set up a business, I'm the director of it, I'm also the owner. Maybe my wife or partner is, maybe a friend is, another director, whatever. Most companies in the world behave like that. There is nothing inherently wrong with a complex corporate structure. If you're operating, as we do as an organization, we operate now and employ staff in 7 or 8 countries. That is a complex undertaking. Having different entities set up in different places to make that work, that's not what we do, but companies would if they were employing across jurisdictions. That's an entirely legitimate use. So the problem is not multiple companies and complex corporate structures. It's that can be abused. And the way that we stop it from being abused, or we reduce the likelihood of it being abused, is being clear who ultimately owns all of those companies that exist in the complex structure. So no, for the average business, there really isn't a threat around this. My own sense is that really it's just upside. If you're operating in the marketplace and you're contracting with another legal person, another company, it is good information for you to know who is the beneficial owner of that. Pretty much every guide for doing basic due diligence will tell you to find out who is the ultimate owner and controller of the company you're working with. As it currently stands, in many jurisdictions around the world, if you want that information, you will have to go out and pay for it. And you will often have to pay quite a lot for it if you're going to one of the big corporate due diligence companies. So people don't. So as a result of this information not being available, most companies do not have the luxury of performing even basic due diligence when they enter into some kind of counterparty agreement with somebody else. So I think for the majority of businesses, transparency of beneficial ownership is all good side. And to be honest, when we talk about the kind of burden of having to disclose your beneficial ownership, actually, for the most part, most companies are dead straightforward and it's really easy to do. There's a bit of kind of work to do to educate people about what that means and help them fill out the forms. But if you don't have a complex corporate structure, and most businesses in most jurisdictions don't, it's pretty straightforward, and year to year, it's not going to change. So to my mind, it's pretty much all upside.
So earlier, though, you talked a little bit about how there's been this exponential growth in countries adopting or committing to beneficial ownership transparency reform registries. So with that, are there any success stories? Like, are there any models that countries can look to and be like, wow, that's a great registry. I want to do that?
Yeah, I think there are, and there's more coming online all of the time. One that I love to talk about is Slovakia. They have a really interesting model there where essentially from verifying this information, or from a perspective of making sure this information is accurate, they've set up a system there whereby anyone can query information on the register, and then it is for the company who has filed that information to demonstrate beyond doubt that it's accurate. So it's a kind of reversal of the burden of proof. And it works very, very effectively. And one of the big success stories in the Slovakian case is through their system, it revealed that the now former Czech prime minister retained ownership and control over Slovak agricultural businesses that were in receipt of huge EU subsidy. When he became prime minister of the Czech Republic, he said that he had removed himself entirely from those companies and put them into blind trust. But actually, through the Slovak disclosure system, it was revealed that he maintained ownership and control of them. And the problem there, of course, was as a prime minister of a European country, was involved in EU budgetary discussions, which ultimately he continued to own companies who would benefit from it. So that's a sort of really neat case study of why this matters and why it works. If we look around, I think West Africa's a particular bright spot in terms of pushing ahead with reform now. If we think about Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, doing interesting things in terms of economy-wide disclosure regimes, doing interesting things when it comes to making the online system as easy as possible to use, making sure that it's properly hooked up to the national ID card system so you can verify beneficial owners as real citizens or residents at the point of submission. If you look wider in the continent as well, places like Zambia doing great work to have a similar system, integrate it with other digital systems around ID and the tax system and so on and so forth, but also start to use this information in places that even in 2016 we weren't really talking about, like public procurement. So if you, at the point of tendering for a government contract, you either know the beneficial owners of the companies that are tendering for that, or you ask them in a case where that doesn't exist to provide that information, you can immediately begin to spot interesting patterns of ownership. So cartels forming, for example, or bid rigging, where there's multiple front companies all owned by the same people, all providing similarly priced or lowballing a bid or whatever. So it's that kind of information and the use of beneficial ownership that starts to bleed out into other parts of government and support other things that really matter for keeping more money in the country, saving the public money, spending taxes better, delivering better public services. So yeah, there's a huge amount going on globally, but the point to always emphasize is that no one has a singularly perfect model. Well, Denmark's is pretty good. You'd expect that. No one would have a singularly perfect model, and we're all still trying to figure out exactly how to do this. And I think that's what makes this exciting. We're kind of rethinking the international system of finance and how companies work kind of in real time. And, our role in all of that as open ownership is to help countries do the work and then learn as much as we possibly can from doing it well, fingers crossed, and tell everybody else about it.
So hearing all about the challenges in implementation, some of the models you're talking about, Slovakia and Denmark really got that top of the list. What does this mean for the war in Ukraine? So how important is beneficial ownership going to be in the reconstruction of Ukraine?
It's important now in terms of dealing with the immediate challenge of sanctions enforcement. Quite clearly, you want to know if those people you have sanctioned are actually out of your system or if they're continuing to control businesses within it. I think with respect to the reconstruction and the long-term future of that, I will leave it to extraordinary Ukrainian colleagues to tell that story. My sense would be that in any situation in which there is going to be, fingers crossed, huge investment in that kind of infrastructure work, rebuilding what needs to be rebuilt, there is always risk of diversion of those funds and corruption. So making sure that there is absolute clarity about who owns companies involved in that process and who is in receipt of money is going to be absolutely essential to ensure it's as robust as possible and as non-leaky as possible. I think it's also worth mentioning, and I'm kind of annoyed with myself for not doing it already, Ukraine was a pathfinder on this as well. They introduced beneficial ownership reform pretty soon after the revolution in 2014 and have done amazing efforts to build out a countrywide beneficial ownership register, thinking hard about how to verify that information. And you've got some amazing companies in Ukraine who are making use of that, who are now taking that information, taking global information about beneficial ownership, making it clear who are sanctioned individuals, who are politically exposed people around the world who are linked to those sanctions individuals, and bringing all that information together so it's usable. So companies like YouControl, for example, it's worth checking them out, doing phenomenal work. So Ukraine really has been at the forefront of this journey as well, because I think post 2014, there was a real understanding and appreciation that this was going to be one of those foundational reforms that was going to set the country's corporate governance and financial system off on the right path as they moved away from the former leader.
Fascinating to hear. It really is. And so what's the next frontier of beneficial ownership transparency?
I mean, getting it done, definitely. It's going to be the next frontier, has been the same frontier for a little while. I think getting it done at scale, and we're heading in that direction. People are always impatient, but we'll get there. Figuring out not just how we can have effective systems to verify if the natural persons who call themselves beneficial owners are real or not. That's kind of straightforward. People have passports or other identity documents. I think one of the next frontiers is going to be how we take beneficial ownership information and we bring it together with other information that's held within a government, particularly the tax system, so that you can do the thing that no one's really figured out, which is when I say I own 23% of this company, a government can actually verify to some degree whether that's true. Now, when we talk about verification, we're never talking about true, false. It's never a binary statement. What level of confidence can a government have that someone's self-submitted declaration that they own X percentage of a company is correct? Well, part of that's going to be about integrating it with tax records, using other pieces of information that tell you something about whether or not that statement is likely to be true. But then the next frontier after that is thinking about that at a global scale. So we already have, through a treaty-based system and international agreements, some information being shared between countries about beneficial ownership and bank accounts and so on and so forth, something called the Common Reporting Standard. But it's a really patchy effectiveness of that system. Some countries have better access to it than others. I mean, it's basically a function of how big and powerful you are, whether or not you get that information in an hour or you get it in 3 weeks or probably never. So thinking about a global system of interchange among those governments that want to participate, such that governments at least can have a clear idea of who individuals who are moving transnationally between different countries, what are they doing, and whether or not what they say about what they own is true, that's the next frontier. So a much greater degree of integration of that kind of information. And that comes with trade-offs as well, right? There are downsides. Greater government information sharing can be a good thing. It can also be used for ill. So that's going to have to be handled carefully. But long term, if we want to crack this corruption problem, fundamentally it is transnational. At scale, at least, it's never one person doing a bad thing in their country and keeping the money there. It's always moving somewhere else. So having a meaningful system, an effective system of integration of that kind of data sharing, and enabling countries that aren't the loudest or the most powerful or the richest to have a substantive role in that in terms of what they contribute, but also what they get out of it, that I think is the long-term frontier for this.
Well, it's been a great discussion, Thom. I really appreciate you coming on. I'm sure all the listeners do as well. Before we go, is there any event or report you want to promote that's coming out of Open Ownership soon?
I think as we look ahead to the autumn, a couple of big things. One thing would be the International Anti-Corruption Conference, which is happening in Washington, D.C. in December. That's organized by Transparency International. I think given that that's in the US this year and the US government is taking a really significant leadership role on the conversation about anti-corruption and doing really effective work on sanctions, but also supporting through things like the Summit for Democracy. It's trying to think about what the world is going to look like over the next 20 years and where sorting corruption fits into that. I think that event in DC, the dates I can't quite remember, is going to be really important. So I think that's probably the thing I'd want to pick out most.
Fantastic. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the event, IACC, International Anti-Corruption Conference, will be from December 6th through 10th. But you can learn more at Transparency International's website. To learn more about open ownership, you can learn more at openownership.org. Thom, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Richard.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit CIPE.org.